So it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Phoebe Barnard, who I got introduced to virtually. She was pretty far south in the southern hemisphere of South America with a colleague of mine from the University of Rhode Island, and we got connected, and I tried to persuade her to make a stop here on her complex travel routes across our planet, and amazingly enough, it worked. As you'll hear, Phoebe's got incredibly broad but synthetic interests and expertise, kind of astonishingly to me, that started with a very stellar career as an evolutionary biologist working on things like birds. But you'll see that her interests have fanned out from there, but in a way that I think holds together very well and extremely relevant for the challenges we face. So she's the lead scientist in climate change adaptation at the South African National Biodiversity Institute in Cape Town. She is also a research associate at the Center of Excellence at the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town, honorary president of BirdLife South Africa, expertise in climate change, behavioral ecology, even those things connected together is pretty interesting, evolution and ornithology. Lots of really pioneering work on conservation issues, biodiversity issues in Namibia, which, by the way, is one of probably a bunch of reasons why she was awarded the Distinguished Achievement Award from the Society for Conservation Biology for that work in Namibia. And unless I'm mistaken, that's when Mac was the president of that society, and so she kind of got the, you don't know Mac, he's back there, and if you want an award like this, just go see Mac afterwards. I'm sure it's just something he can arrange. He's a very influential person, even though he's just from Maine. So
I've got a signature digitally if you need to forward.
Oh, even better.
It's on my office.
And by the way, you might sort of say, oh, you know, who gets those awards? Well, at the same Society for Conservation Biology meeting, David Attenborough also received an award of outstanding achievement, so kind of a special group to be among. Just going to say that Phoebe is from New England, and in fact did a biology degree at Acadia University, then went on to do a zoology degree at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, and on to Uppsala in Sweden for a degree in animal ecology, PhD. So today, I think she's going to remind us that there's another hemisphere on our planet, and that there's a lot to be learned there, a lot of challenges faced, probably some things that both don't translate well in terms of not only the challenges but the solutions, but also places that we can really learn a lot from the innovative work that's being done there by Phoebe and her colleagues. Today's talk is titled World Upside Down, Charting Climate and Biodiversity Futures in Africa and the Global South. Welcome, Phoebe.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so embarrassed. Are you normally so prone to hyperbole? Stellar career is a little bit over the top, but thank you. That's very kind of you, David. And I'm really very pleased and gratified to be able to talk to you. The Mitchell Center is full of such good work and such good people, and it's really an honor for me to be given a time slot, especially at the end of the term, so thank you for coming on a rainy day too. I would like to ask that if you can't hear me, because I'm not used to microphones, it's also my bedtime as far as my brain is concerned, and my tongue is furry because I had potato chips at lunch. So just wave your arms if I'm not making sense. I hope that this talk won't seem a little bit superficial. It's almost going to be a data-free talk. I'm going to reflect on policy, planning, difficulties, solutions, toolboxes. I'm not going to give much of my own data, but I'm very happy to answer questions about my data if asked, and I'll give you more papers than you ever wanted to read if you really want to. But I wanted to take a fairly ice skating skim around the perspectives that I've built up in my advanced years working mainly in Africa. Now, I know that some of you have spent time in Africa, considerable amount of time, so forgive me, those of you who know the southern hemisphere and Africa better than others. I want to remind us all, because I slip into this mistake myself, of remembering Africa, the romance, Africa, the aesthetic, Africa, the beautiful deep stirrings in our soul, and all of that it is. Anyone here climbed Mount Kilimanjaro? It doesn't always have herds of high-resolution elephants walking past it. I think the guys actually have to stand there for quite some time. I was keen to climb it in the end. I decided it was so crowded I wanted to climb Mount Meru instead, which is a more recently active volcano and much more beautiful and biodiverse. If you ever get to Tanzania, try to climb Mount Meru. Spectacular mountain, just next door to Kilimanjaro, and 1,000 meters less, but still enough to give you a good workout over 4 days. Then, of course, there's Africa, the seedy, the downtrodden, and the difficult struggles to bring national development and regional development to people. Then, of course, there's Africa of CNN. We deal in the north with too many stereotypes of Africa, too many assumptions about what it is and what it isn't. And I've lived in all of these Africas, as well as this kind of Africa. People still ask whether I live in a hut in Cape Town. Fortunately not, although I have lived in rondavels. So, this is me, I'm Phoebe, and my main job is at the National Biodiversity Institute. I'm very lucky to work at one of the most beautiful workplaces on the planet at the base of Table Mountain Cliffs, and I'm lucky to live also in a pretty good state up on this valley, close to the top of the hill here, where just over the mountain, which is part of the Table Mountain National Park, there are peregrines, there are jackal buzzards, there are white-necked ravens. It's a beautiful place. So the specifics are, as David said, ornithology background, getting into futures research now. So just about the talk. This is also the local road down in Cape Town, and I decided it was quite metaphorical because we've really got a cliff here, and if we're not careful, it's easy to dive over the end. And I think the future seems a lot like that to me when we talk about sustainability. But I'd like to give essentially a personal view from the Southern Hemisphere, then talk a little bit about society and the kind of society that we want and countries making the society that they want. A little bit about climate and biodiversity futures, not very much. And then a few of the toolboxes that we use down there in trying to chart the world ahead. So you will know the Gini coefficients. South Africa, Brazil, Chile, Namibia, and surprisingly China often appear very poorly on these maps. And
you know what, it's possible somebody doesn't know what the Gini coefficient is. You might just for maybe a few.
quite right. The Gini coefficient, the world indicator of national scale, usually, inequality, is an important index of what's wrong in society. And therefore, I find it very helpful to look at how we can try to put right what's wrong in society at the same time as trying to transform the economy, make environmental management more sustainable. But of course, the Southern Hemisphere, you'd like this, has a pretty obvious difference from the North. What's one of them? What do you notice about this map? Apart from the fact that it may be unusual perspective.
Less landmass.
Yeah. It's a pretty oceanic hemisphere. And from an ecological and evolutionary point of view, that's pretty significant. but the differences that arise from that very oceanic climate seldom percolate into the global change ecology literature. So we're scurrying to catch up. I think it's fair to say that most of our ecological knowledge and theory and conservation biology knowledge and theory has come from the north. And I'm working increasingly with people across the hemisphere to try and push that right. Of course, the southern hemisphere is itself a very varied place. We have Australia and New Zealand, which are highly productive, South Africa, which is pretty productive, a lot of the rest of Africa and South America not so productive. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but working more with colleagues in Chile and the other continents. So where is this? Any ideas? It's my back garden again. So here is Cape Town. Here's the Cape Peninsula down to Cape Point, which is wrongly believed to be the meeting point of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, that place oceanographically is closer to there. And you will see this area, the Cape Flats, which was underwater for much of paleohistory, and which will be again before too long. Speaking of inequality, people living here are really living the dream of the gorgeous, beautiful Cape Town, voted one of the most entrancing and tantalizing places on the planet to live. And who wouldn't want to live this way? Only about 12 kilometers, 14 kilometers away, on the Cape Flats in Athlone and Lavender Hill, this is the view from somebody's window, not over the sparkling Atlantic, but into the back garden of a drug lord's den in Lavender Hill. So, growing up in New England, my story was of going to Africa as a young married woman to take a job at Oxford, with Oxford University in Zimbabwe. Didn't work out quite that simply. And ended up not just staying 2 years, but staying so far 33 years. And most of the experience that I'm talking about will be from Namibia and South Africa here, although I have worked and lived for a while and supported biodiversity planning processes in Zimbabwe, in Botswana, in Tanzania, in Uganda, and in Senegal. So I have a little tiny bit of experience in the rest of the continent. But the other maps are just to show that a recent consortium that we're working on is trying to pull together expertise on biodiversity vulnerability to climate change and land use change from the other Gondwana continents. So I'm starting a consortium called the Gondwana Edges Project, which is looking at endemic species, birds and plants and insects mainly so far, on the southern tips and the western tips of the three main remaining Gondwana continents left in the southern hemisphere. What's the main one that isn't? Pop quiz. Which Gondwana continent is now well and truly in the northern hemisphere? Glad you're on your toes. So I'm collaborating quite a lot with people at the University of Queensland, at James Cook University, at the University of Adelaide, and at the Universidad de Magallanes. I'm sorry for my bad Spanish. Down in Puerto Williams and Punta Arenas. So that will be getting off the ground. But just to go back for a minute to my time of crossing the equator, as in that previous photo, and those weren't my feet. I hasten to say I never paint my toenails. For a while, going to Africa as a young married woman, I encountered the National Geographic view of Africa. Very beautiful. And if you'll indulge me for just a second, because I think people do relate to a personal story, my life was caught between wanting to explore the wilderness of South Africa, which was very beautiful then, and raise my baby, and living in an abandoned railway station there next to the Kruger National Park, so that lions would come by in the night and roar and rattle the sash windows enough to wake you up. And it was a wonderful time. But of course there's also South Africa, the country in ferment. Now, I told you that I was going with Oxford University to a project in Zimbabwe, and that didn't turn out, because Zimbabwe was also in ferment at the time, and our contact in Zimbabwe fled the country at the last minute. So here we are sitting in Canada, having just got married, my English ornithologist husband and I, about to get on the plane with plane tickets that our friends had clubbed together and bought us for a wedding present to Zimbabwe, and it all fell apart. So we decided to go to Africa anyway and make a plan B. Well, I was quite a political person, and I couldn't live in South Africa and just do the National Geographic thing. I had to find out what was going on in the underbelly of the country. So I joined a women's human rights organization that was working to try to represent the interests of political prisoners at the time. This was still too uncomfortably the dark days of apartheid, and I really didn't want to be there. It was a fascinating, fascinating time. My reason for telling you this is not, I hope, to be self-indulgent, but to make the point that countries have a pretty veneer, and they have an unstable social environment that demands recognition, and that was certainly South Africa during those times, and it is very much still today. And it's that I want to touch on now, the fascination and the opportunity of being able to work with two countries on the cusp of independence, Namibia in 1990 and South Africa in 1994, although I only went back to it in 2003. Now, I was very lucky to get offered a job at the University of Namibia, and I loved to teach, and I loved to work with young scientists, so this was cool to me. Now, anyone been to Namibia? It's a spectacular country, isn't it? With dune fields and gravel plains and subtropical wetlands, and it's still one of the countries closest to my heart. And I arrived more or less at the time that South Africa was handing over responsibility for Namibia, with F.W. de Klerk, the last white president, handing over to Sam Nujoma, the first Namibian president, as previously it had been Southwest Africa. And the country was also in ferment because the white guy in the black and white picture on your right was Anton Lubowski, a human rights lawyer who had been working for the SWAPO party and had immense respect from everyone in the country. He was assassinated the day I arrived. And so everyone was out in the streets protesting and sobbing and rioting. Yeah, it was quite a time. But Namibia, at its independence, was an incredibly optimistic place to be. So this is my point. One sometimes has opportunities in life to grab a moment in time and make some small difference for a little bit of time in a small place maybe. Namibia is a backwater in the global geopolitics, but it had some pretty amazing things going for it. One of those was its constitution, one of the most progressive and liberal in the world, still to this day. So, Article 95L explicitly protects biodiversity and ecosystem services and the sustainable use of natural resources. And, I didn't put this in, but it also explicitly prevented toxic waste dumping of radioactive material from the US and the Soviet Union. And whoever wrote that into the Constitution had a good reason for doing so. So this was a wonderful opportunity, a young country just at the cusp of independence with a fantastic policy framework in place that was just waiting to be implemented. But here's the National Geographic version of Namibia. Gorgeous. Anyone a rock climber here? The Spitzkoppe is the most fantastic place to climb, except I nearly cut not only my climbing career but my life short by falling off it. But that is an amazing country and had incredible rich biodiversity and ancient endemics along the western escarpment of the country. So here is a situation where a new government had plenty of development imperatives and might be easily have been expected to put biodiversity to one side during that process. Now, just remember, this country had just been under colonial rule of South Africa since, I think, 1948. German and South African colonial rule for most of the previous century. During that time, conservation was done by white guys wearing khaki with epaulets and carrying guns, who would come and put up a fence and declare a national park and throw everyone out, and that was not very popular. So conservation had a really problematic history, a tainted image. And in my university teaching work at first, and then later working for the government, this was the big elephant in the room that we had to tackle in order to move past that very troubled history, because a lot of people remembered it uncomfortably. So one might regard this as an intractable problem. You've got a small population, it was less than 2 million people, but at the same time very much in need of education, of health services, of better housing, of a whole range of employment opportunities. And at the same time, there's constitutional imperative for sustainable development, biodiversity conservation. Well, the only option we had was to merge them and go on a real campaign to turn people's heads around about what it was all about. It was not an easy thing, and I certainly didn't do it all. There were many, many people involved in it. So two of the first things that we had to do as a signatory to the Biodiversity Convention, but also to get the basic stuff out there for government policy, was to produce a book, a country study, to take stock of what we knew, and we converted that to an issue of biodiversity and conservation, and then to put together a national strategy and action plan for biodiversity. And because it wasn't seemingly enough to work 18 hours a day running a national biodiversity program, because no one else was starting a national climate change program, and Namibia is the driest country south of the Sahara, and therefore quite vulnerable to climate change, well, I thought, okay, I can probably get by on 4 hours sleep for a while. So we started a national climate change program, but then a year later we were able to find someone to hire to take over from me. And Namibia, I'm happy to say, was the first country in the ILTER network in Africa, even before South Africa, which today admittedly has a much more organized and expensive LTER network. But we engaged quite heavily in environmental observation, small network in the country, and unfortunately only the Desert Research Foundation of Namibia at Kopepep is still an active part of it. My point in telling you all this is that countries like Namibia and South Africa had opportunities to vision as part of the whole UN thing that they bought into, but also very much as a planning exercise at that point in their evolution to ask, what kind of society do we want to have? What's important to us? Where do we want to be in 5, 10, 20, 25, 30 years' time? And so we spent a lot of time with the President and the National Planning Commission putting together documents like this. And there were quite some conflicts. Like any other country, the Ministry of Environment was marginalized and weak and not able to stand up to the ministries of trade and industry or finances or health. But nonetheless, Namibia managed to get itself on the road to sustainability and have a vibrant, clean, bustling little city and be a success story in Africa because of the hard work of quite a few hundred people right at a crucial moment in time. But back to South Africa for a minute. I went back to South Africa in 2003, wanting to have a break from the quite stressful demands of being a minister's advisor on biodiversity and climate change in almost the complete lack of any scientific evidence whatsoever on either of those things, for several reasons, all quite plebeian. One, the library of the Ministry of Environment had been packed up for several years. Two, there was no functioning internet most of the time, so you couldn't really access literature very often. Three, politicians tended to make policy by fiat and whim rather than evidence anyway. So our best hope was really just to kind of build up good relations and talk with the ministers and try to persuade them of wise paths and hope that a cabinet reshuffle didn't come around too often that would really make your relationships have to start from scratch again. But moving to South Africa, I decided that I wanted to step back into a research role a little bit. And I had meanwhile been involved in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which all of you will, I'm sure, know, both on the board, which was a very exciting thing for me, and in the Scenarios Working Group. And you will remember this classic summary slide from the MA, which showed climate change in the second column there, and nutrient pollution on the far right as the real drivers of rapid environmental change that every country had to get a grip on. And South Africa was no exception as a highly agricultural country. Now, my office is here, and that's Table Mountain's cliff. And I'm happy to say that I was able to join in a permanent role, which is strange for a foreigner, some of the most talented teams I've ever had the pleasure to work with. And although they're not widely known in the academic literature for it, South Africa really has been an absolute world-beating leader in several things. Just ask the World Bank, they'll tell you. They love South Africa and they love Namibia. Particularly with the effectiveness of mainstreaming biodiversity in public policy, planning and implementation, in the mining sector, in the subsistence sector less so, but very successful in those things, and in systematic conservation planning at provincial and local levels as well as national levels. And fortunately, very good geospatially explicit planning information. Now, this is not my work directly, this is my colleagues' work, but I feel that being a foreigner, I'm able to say to them, you know, you guys may not be so good at this, but you really are world-beating in this and this and this, and they are. Now, the South African cabinet took a policy decision a few years ago to move to a low-carbon economy. This is a tricky thing. They have Sasol, the world, which was at one point at least the world's single biggest point source of greenhouse gas emissions, a synthetic fuels factory. And it's an economy which still relies heavily on dirty coal. But increasingly, it is trying to get its head around a transition to a low-carbon, restoration ecology-based economy. Now, it looks fabulous on paper. Like everything else, it's struggling in implementation. But you may know of these, what in South Africa are called the working for programs. There's working for water, working for wetlands, working on fire. And they're essentially restoration ecology projects that are meant to improve ecosystem services like water supply, water flow, through the removal of alien plants and the restoration of wetlands and things like that. So millions and millions of dollars have been pumped into these programs on a trial basis, and they've had incredible flaws, I must say. I was lucky enough to work for the top guy who conceived all these programs. They've spent millions on them. They have failed to do sufficient work in follow-up and in active restoration ecology, but nonetheless it's a fabulous pilot for how big chunks of the economy can employ people and can restore natural capital instead of just exploiting it and leaving it behind. So all of that is really just to emphasize that the South is lucky to have a few relatively simple societies, and by that I just mean simple, that they're not dragged down by complex politics and territoriality and institutional conflict of the sort that you have in this country, to ask what kind of society do we want and how are we going to get there. And increasingly we're trying to push that this should actually be the basis for a new economy, that restoration rather than exploitation is simply the conceptual paradigm that we have to shift in everybody's minds. Okay, so just a tiny bit on biodiversity futures before I end, and the little toolboxes that we use. Oceanic hemisphere. The southern hemisphere has been really dragging behind. We're dawdling, but we're now struggling to catch up. I've been trying to work on a couple of hemispheric reviews of the state of our knowledge of climate change responses from a phenology point of view, the timing of events in the life cycle of species, and also in the kind of long-term data sets for global change. Australia dominates this hemisphere very much, but it's helping push Africa and South America much further into a good state. South America is in quite a good state. We have some of the best climatologists and IPCC experts working in South Africa, these are actually quite old figures, but looking at patterns, seasonal patterns of change in rainfall, change in evapotranspiration, change in soil moisture, and therefore food security. But there are a few things that are fundamentally different, I think, that drive global change in the southern hemisphere. Partly because of the kinds of vegetation types that we have, and partly because of the oceanic conditions. Fire is a big issue there, not so much here. And it is being driven partly by vegetation change, partly by increased temperature and aridity and wind. Those of you who've been to Cape Town, you'll know it's not for the faint-hearted. If you don't like wind, you tend not to last in Cape Town. But the other issue, I think, is bush encroachment. Now, my colleagues at SANBI, the National Biodiversity Institute, had done some experimental work to look at how powerfully CO2 enrichment was actually driving bush encroachment. But there are many reasons for it, as you may know. Changes in grazing pressure, changes in fire regimes, changes in rainfall. But the sum total of all of these issues is that bush encroachment is fast taking over much of semi-arid Africa. And that is a disaster for rangeland owners and managers. It reduces their carrying capacity significantly. And an early study in Namibia showed that 102 Namibian US dollars per year, which is probably a tiny fraction of the real cost, were lost every year to bush encroachment 20 years ago. And even if that figure is quite inaccurate, it actually had a galvanizing effect on policymakers, because suddenly there was a value, and therefore they realized there was a problem, and then they were willing to take action. But before that, it didn't mean anything to them. Okay, so I suppose I really just want to go to the toolboxes. I think I've probably put my slides in the wrong order here, but essentially our toolboxes for trying to track and manage environmental change and our own set of constantly changing wicked problems are really strong collaborations, because even South Africa, which has a high, almost from my perspective, an embarrassment of riches, of expertise, of money, of projects, of political will. Even from Namibia's perspective, South Africa is an embarrassment of riches. But even they do not have enough scientists to do the work. So we rely a lot on collaboration, South-South, South-North. And we're investing quite a lot now in systems analysis approach. So I've just come from Vienna, where I was there at IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and a whole coterie of PhD students and their supervisors, including me, were lucky enough to spend a week there, and we will be working intensively with IASA over the next 3 years to try and build up capacity in systems analysis, and particularly risk and resilience issues. And so although this is a Northern Hemisphere example from them, you will know probably that IASA has a whole bunch of very powerful and interesting models that help people think through the wicked problems and trade-offs of trying to manage land use planning decisions and the economic and social costs of various decisions. So for me, this is very exciting because I'm actually quite an unquantitative ecologist. So I need to work with statistical ecologists and modelers. I can't do it myself, I know I can't. And it's helped me realize that the whole issue of wicked problems is not what any dictionary says. For me, it's just a matter of having the people around the table to talk through problems and trade-offs and make sense of them. And where necessary, to have the modeling tools that help you work through the problem in a systematic, quantitative way until there are figures on the table that help resolve people that are sitting on the fence. And for me, that's what a wicked problem and its resolution and systems analysis really is all about. So, in addition to those, I really should have had this slide a few slides ago. I just want to mention that I can't go past the slide without pointing out some of the beautiful birds that I still get the chance to work with in the Fynbos Global Biodiversity Hotspot down near Cape Town. I run a whole research team of postdocs and PhD students on endemic species. We are able to combine the kind of standard professional ecological work with citizen science, which I'll tell you about in a sec, and with systems analysis and other tools in a way that I think will be quite useful for making decisions about things. So my institute is essentially a science policy institute, and we are nationally responsible for monitoring, for climate change bioadaptation, for a whole bunch of issues that we don't have the capacity to deal with. But luckily, like Britain and other countries, including the US, we have a fairly avid citizen science community, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. And whereas at the start, I must say, it was very much middle-class, middle-aged, sensible shoe-wearing white people, it's now taking off just like cycling has. So any person wearing Lycra probably also has an app with a smartphone that they're collecting bird atlas data on. It's remarkable. Not not sufficiently widespread yet, but we're getting there. So, you know, the need was clear. We don't have enough people or money. We have huge advantages in terms of long-term data sets and a lot of citizen scientists. And those citizen scientists contribute at least 20 South African rands for every 1 rand that my institute puts into these projects. So it's a significant asset that we need to capitalize on. If you don't know any of these species atlas data sets, do yourself a favor and go look them up. Most of them are on the website of an organization called the Animal Demography Unit, ADU, at the University of Cape Town. And the Southern African Bird Atlas program, project number 2, I shouldn't get it wrong because I chaired the steering committee from its start until last year, has produced one of the biggest and best biodiversity databases in the whole of Africa. And this has made it really easy for us to do time series work on the effects of global change. So here we have a secretary bird. Shame, I actually meant to put, no, sorry. I meant to put, somebody else put in those animations, I'm sorry, I hate them, but I don't know how to get them out. Do you know what a secretary bird looks like? It's an incredibly unusual, evolutionarily distinct tall raptor, long legs, goes stomping through the savannas catching snakes and grabbing them. They're beautiful. But this bird is falling through the cracks of extinction. So on this map, every red grid cell, which is a 1/4 degree grid cell, shows local extinction of that bird. Every orange grid cell shows a decline in reporting rates, relative abundance. The blue shows colonizations, and the green shows a relative increase of reporting rates or relative abundance. The outlook for this species is quite bleak, and it's not necessarily doing well in protected areas either. So this kind of citizen science data set tells us what we otherwise wouldn't know. And it's absolutely crucial that we continue to invest in these. So what I've been doing is bouncing around with government, trying to say, yes, you need to keep investing in this. It's incredibly valuable, and look at what we're getting. And so we can take those sorts of data and turn them into analyses in good journals about changes in migration pattern or changes in species ranges. And I just want to mention that from those we've been able to develop what I'm calling an early warning system for biodiversity. So just to finish off, I want to leave you with the concept of early warning systems for biodiversity. We have them for tsunamis, we have them for financial shocks, we have them for disease outbreaks, we have them for desertification and drought. But essentially we need to know when species are in trouble, like the secretary bird, and that's one of hundreds. We've just published the new Red Data Book for birds, and that's got a lot of species that have been uplisted. Before it's too late, because once a species has changed its range, it's too late. That population is extinct. So we've been producing a couple of, oh my God, these make me dizzy, sorry. We've been producing a couple of booklets for policymakers to try and ram home the idea that they need to be tracking these things if they want to get a handle on environmental health. So our solution for this thing has been to have roundtables with senior policymakers, to bring on board data from citizen scientists, to show how it's galvanizing and making enthusiastic people across society, even from sometimes quite low incomes, and they feel empowered to track and therefore help predict biodiversity change in the future. Richard Primack has got got us to do a little paper on this. So it hopefully will be out in Biological Conservation in the next month or 2 or 3. So to conclude, thank you for being patient with me. I feel that we live in a very different hemisphere down there, and that we need to look quite carefully at how it differs and what lessons we are observing and learning about biodiversity change, about land use change, about the ways that we can solve environmental and social problems through different tools. That at least these two societies, but I would say many countries in Africa and many post-colonial countries have had the opportunity to vision where they want to be, and that's a powerful thing, because I think every country needs to do it. Certainly the US needs to do it. And most countries don't get the chance because they're bogged down in complexity, political, economic, so on, social. That climate and biodiversity futures in the South, certainly in Southern Africa, have been influenced quite strongly by drivers that are a little bit different from those in the North, as well as all the particular societal curveballs that I haven't even mentioned in this talk. That, you know, the land grabs, the biofuels development, the oil palm plantations, and so on. And finally, that just with these quite simple and different tools, from systems analysis with incredibly complex models, or even the kind of simple verbal models that I can do, and horizon scanning processes, and roundtables with politicians, and the use of citizen science and traditional science data, can be quite effective in trying to be able to solve our conundrum of how to merge social development with environmental health. So thank you for your patience with me, and I hope that gave you some ideas that we could discuss over a beer or whatever, if anyone has time. Thank you.
Plenty of time for questions, and by the way, if people want to hang around afterwards, we're likely to go across and grab a beer or do something like that. So you're welcome to join us.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
So do you think that it was an advantage in both Namibia and South Africa that tourism and ecotourism have been a pretty good incentive to things?
Yeah, for sure, you are absolutely right. And I think both countries have felt that, that's been for some time at least their fastest growing economic sector. AV tourism in South Africa is an incredibly fast growing economic sector, but it's starting out quite small. I've been personally a little bit reluctant to advise policymakers to put too much emphasis on tourism. Because it gives the idea that biodiversity only matters to foreigners or somebody else. And B, simply because it's so vulnerable to shocks in the system. If there's a terrorist attack or a sudden spike in oil prices or electromagnetic pulse, then things fall apart, as we know. So I do have my doubts about it, but absolutely, if ecotourism hadn't been a big deal in both of those countries, it would have been a significantly harder sell economically. That's a good point. Mac?
I've only heard very positive things about the Working for Water program. You suggested that there are some significant problems there. Have they been resolved, or are they fundamental things that are not resolved?
Look, they're big and expensively funded programs, so it's inevitable that somebody's going to find something to snipe about. South Africans make a national pastime of sniping sometimes, but I would say most of it's been sorted out, but at the implementation level, they still have some work to do. So effectively, the issues in the midterm review of those programs were essentially that they weren't emphasizing active restoration. So teams would go in, a woman or a guy will be paid 40 or 50 rands, which is nothing really. It's maybe $3 a day, $4 a day. to go and work hard to cut down invasive alien trees in the landscape, because they really are choking out the landscape and throttling the water supply. And they'll leave piles of brush, but they won't necessarily follow up sufficiently, and they certainly won't go and plant natural species back again. It's assumed that the seed bank will be enough to cope, and that indigenous species will bounce back. In practice, it's not often the case, and there have been tipping points for some of those species, some of those ecosystems rather, where grasses are moving in because of the disturbance and so on and so on. So there's a lot of that, and that is quite difficult to really solve. I do think the teams are trying hard to improve. But yeah, it's not perfect, but it's an amazing example of how to take an economy that has been focused on, diamond mining and gold mining and coal mining and fishing, and turn it around to something that essentially looks forward. I love it. I really do. Yes?
You mentioned fires earlier on, and I'm just curious if there's as aggressive of an anti-fire regime as there is in the United States, or even in Australia before they started prescribed burning.
Yeah, you mean an active fire suppression policy?
Yeah, so like an anti forest fire kind of a regime, or what is there? Is that relatively prevalent in?
There has been too much of a fire suppression policy, certainly in the large municipal area of Cape Town. Okay, that's an area of 4 million people in Greater Cape Town, with fancy houses like the ones I showed you, as well as township shacks, which are all vulnerable to fires. And so up until recently, the ecologists had not been very effective, or maybe trying hard enough, to influence that policy. Fynbos, the global biodiversity hotspot there, is a fire-driven ecosystem. It needs fire between 7 and 25 years. And if it doesn't get that, then species go extinct. And so balancing that with property protection and urban management has been a really tricky thing. And it's a very expensive thing, because it's mostly done by helicopters. I guess in California too. It's very steep terrain, and I was for a while a volunteer firefighter, and it's pretty exhausting work. So they were trying to suppress fire more than they should have done, but I think that's changed now.
So do they have any sort of a prescription, a prescribed burning regime at all? Do they
Sure.
do anything like that?
Yeah. So the South African National Parks Board does a lot of that. Private landowners are required to do a lot of that. The city of Cape Town does a lot of that. And it's a big PR challenge, but they managed to get it done. Yeah. I think they're doing quite a good job, I must say. Yes.
Back to the ecotourism issue. I've always been impressed from the outside looking in at the size of the ecotourism engine in South Africa and Namibia. How much of that revenue actually trickles in the local economy, or is it like many other places in East Africa where it's skinned off by Western tour operators?
It's very much better than Kenya. It's similar to Tanzania, which does a better job. I think right from the start, Namibia and South Africa tried to make it very locally based. It was not an easy thing, because there was a lot of training needed for service, and those of you who have been to the region have probably experienced pretty crap service. So it's taken time, but no, I would say it's very much more locally driven and based. There aren't enough community campsites and things like that. If you've traveled in Tanzania or Uganda, you've probably stayed at a community-run campsite. It's relatively hard to find those in South Africa. There's opportunity for growth there. Yeah, thank you.
keeping an eye on the time, and I know some people
Yeah.
have to go, so if anybody who wants to hang around longer, please come on up, and if you want to go get a beer with us or something like that, you're welcome
Yeah,
to do that
sure.
as well. But let's thank Phoebe one more time.
Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate your good questions as well. Thanks.